You have arrived. Excellent. Welcome to my humble abode. Please do have a seat. Make yourself comfortable. Good. Now let me tell you a tale. War is horrific. It brings out some of the worst in humanity. Few instances demonstrate this as much as the 2 world wars. This tale, however, takes place in the first. During World War I, no man's land was a space which separated the front lines of the opposing armies and was perhaps rarely the only location where enemy troops could meet without hostility. It was in no man's land that the spontaneous Christmas truce of December 1914 took place, and where opposing troops might unofficially agree to safely remove their wounded comrades, or even sunbathe on the first days of spring. But it could also be the most terrifying of places, one that held the greatest danger for combatants. Men drowning in shell holes already filled with decaying flesh, wounded men beyond help from behind the wire, dying over a number of days, their cries audible and often unbearable to those in the trenches. Sappers buried alive beneath its surface, wrote scholar Fran Brereton. No man's land, said poet Wilfred Owen, was like the face of the moon, chaotic, crater-ridden, uninhabitable, awful, the abode of madness. During the Great War, a legend arose out of the real-life horrors that occurred in this wartime hellhole. Like all tales passed down the generations, it had several variants, but the underlying message warned of scar-faced and fearless deserters banding together from nearly all sides: Australian, Austrian, British, Canadian, French, German, and Italian, living deep beneath the abandoned trenches and dugouts. According to some versions, the deserters scavenged corpses for clothing, food, and weapons. And in at least one version, the deserters emerged nightly as ghoulish beasts to feast upon the dead and dying, waging epic battles over the choicest portions. One of the earliest published versions of the wild deserters legend appeared in the 1920 memoir The Squadroon by Ardern Arthur Hulme Beeman, a lieutenant colonel in the British cavalry. No other telling of the legend, at least in print, is as horrifying as Beeman's. Written just 2 years after the war's end, Beeman's tale begins in early 1918 on the marshes of the Somme in northern France. This is where some of the bloodiest battles of the war were fought, and Beeman is convinced that he has witnessed 24 or so German prisoners of war vanish into the ground. He wants to send a search party into the maze of abandoned trenches, but is advised against it because the area was peopled with wild men, British, French, Australian, German deserters who lived there underground, like ghouls among the moldering dead, and who came out at nights to plunder and to kill. In the night, an officer told him, mingled with the snarling of carrion dogs, they often heard inhuman cries and rifle shots coming from that awful wilderness, as though the bestial denizens were fighting among themselves. Another gruesome description of wartime outlaws and deserters came in the 1948 5-volume autobiography Laughter in the Next Room by Sir Osbert Sitwell, a 5th baronet and a captain in the army. He was also the younger brother of the poet Dame Edith Sitwell. In recalling Armistice Day 1918, Sitwell wrote, "For 4 long years, the sole internationalism, if it existed, had been that of deserters from all the warring nations, French, Italian, German, Austrian, Australian, English, Canadian. Outlawed, these men lived, at least they lived, in caves and grottos under certain parts of the front line, cowardly but desperate as the lazzaroni of the old kingdom of Naples or the bands of beggars and coney catchers of Tudor times, recognizing no right and no rules save of their own making. They would issue forth, it was said, from their secret lairs, after each of the interminable checkmate battles, to rob the dying of their few possessions, treasures such as boots or iron rations, and leave them dead." Sitwell's concluding note is equally chilling. British troops believed that the general, staff could find no way of dealing with these bandits until the war was over, and that in the end, they, the deserters, had to be gassed. A more recent literary account comes in 1985 from No Man's Land by Reginald Hill, author of some 50 novels, many of them police procedurals. The novel begins with Josh Routledge, a British deserter from the Battle of the Somme, and a German soldier-turned-pacifist, Lothar von Seeberg, being chased by mounted military police. Out of almost nowhere, a band of 40 deserters, mostly Australian, attack the military police and take Josh and Lothar into their dugout. They were a wild-looking gang, in dirty, ragged clothing and with unkempt hair and unshaven faces. They were also very well armed. In a second instance, these deserters come swarming out of nowhere, out of the bowels of the earth. That's how it looked. They was scruffy, dead scruffy, sort of rugged and wild-looking, more like a bunch of pirates than anything. There was one big brute, nigh on 7 foot tall he looked. The legend seems to have also taken root in modern journalistic accounts. James Carroll in the International Herald Tribune noted in 2006 how World War I deserters refusing to fight had organized themselves into a kind of third force, not fighters anymore, but mere survivors, at home in the caverns. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Human beings caring for one another, no matter what uniform they were wearing. According to Carroll's interpretation, these deserters were like angels, taking care of those who had fallen into the safety of the underground caverns, acting as a sane alternative to the insanity of war. The wild deserters of no man's land, whether angels or devils, or even flesh-eating ghouls who emerge only at night, is the stuff of a legend extremely rich in symbolic value. It reminds us today, a century after it began, of the madness, chaos, and senselessness of all the horrors of war. So that concludes our tale. I do hope you enjoyed it. Sleep tight, and beware what lurks the night.